Now, the 1970 elections, arguably to this day, are considered the freest and fairer elections in Pakistan's history, and the outcome was, in a sense, the worst nightmare of the establishment. And you could see now, with hindsight, that their reasoning behind the 1956 constitution came back to haunt them. Because when the 1970 election declared, or the order announcing the 1970 election declared the end of one unit, meaning all the provinces were restored back to their historical identity, parity was done away with, and one man, one vote was allowed. So a genuinely democratic election. And lo and behold, what happened was that Maulana Bhashani, who was a major party in East Pakistan, decided in his wisdom to boycott the elections. That left the field clear for someone called Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, the leader of the Awami League, who had just come out of prison. Why has he come out of prison? Because he was accused in the Agartala conspiracy case of preparing to wage war against the state of Pakistan. How do I know this? My father headed the tribunal that was trying him. My father retired in 1968 as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Ayub was still in power. This is summer 1968. The agitation breaks out in October. Ayub's law minister, S.M. Zafar, came to my father, who, as he always did, my family always did, was in Murray during the summer months. They used to spend 2.5, 3 months in Murray every summer, without fail. So S.M. Zafar, the same S.M. Zafar, is still around, came to see my father. He was the law minister, bringing a message from Field Marshal Ayub Khan, President Field Marshal Ayub Khan, that we wish to set up a tribunal to try Mujibur Rahman and his collaborators. And this conspiracy has been traced to a town called Agartala, which is just across the border from East Pakistan in northeastern India. Hence, it was called the Agartala conspiracy case. Conspiracy cases have been very much a part of Pakistan's history. I'll come to another significant one later called the Hyderabad conspiracy case, in which I have a role also. Now, unknown to me, I was studying in England at the time. Unknown to me, my father refused. He told S.M. Zafar, he said, this is a political trial and I suspect a trumped up trial and I don't want any part of it. So he turned him down. I am sitting as a student in London. When I hear about this, and by now I'm, becoming radicalized, I take the liberty of writing to my father, which would otherwise be unheard of, advising him that this was not a good idea, that he should not take up this case. I don't think he replied to that. I can't recall whether he replied to that or not. I can't remember anything he may have said. But he refused. Then Mujibur Rahman, who was in prison, sent my father a message. He said, please take this case. If you head this tribunal, I will have confidence in it that I will be given justice. So then he accepted, on the plea of Sheikh Mujib. And the tribunal was constituted with him heading it, retired Chief Justice, and 2 judges of the Dhaka High Court. And its hearings were held in Dhaka. And these hearings were in progress when the agitation broke out in October 1968. And on one occasion when my father was in Dhaka for a hearing, a mob arrived at the agitation was going on. A mob arrived at the state guest house and burnt the place down. And my father escaped by the skin of his teeth through the back door, and with nothing but the shirt on his back, and was transported immediately back to Lahore, West Pakistan, where he arrived literally in sandals and the shirt on his back. So this is quite a famous incident. Subsequently, when Sheikh Mujib was released and so on, I'll tell you that story later, how he apologized to my father. I'll come to that later. So my family, as you can see, had a great intricate connection with these events. And so the establishment, I was saying, came to the conclusion that, some things had to be done differently. So free and fair elections, one man, one vote, one unit gone, parity gone. Okay? And before the 70 elections were held, Yahya sued for a ceasefire and peace with the Baloch resistance. And he did that through his governor, Air Marshal Noor Khan, ex-Air Force chief, and very well thought of, made PIA what it is, what it was, not what it is, one of the finest airlines in the world, and so on and so forth. So very highly thought of, very highly respected person. And he negotiated then a ceasefire with the Baloch resistance, prisoners release, autonomy to be retained by the tribes, guerrillas not to surrender their arms, keep them. And so, it was the recognition, if you like, of the stalemate. No further demands were made. So just ceasefire, disengagement of the protagonists, release of prisoners, so on and so forth. Now this turn of events obviously was historic. It was a historic moment. And the Baloch, who were largely represented at that time in the National Awami Party, Wali. By now Wali and Bhashani had split. Why had they split? They split because of the Sino-Soviet split, which happened in 1963. Okay? When the Chinese and Soviet split, the international communist movement split, all parties with either direct affiliation or sympathies with either Moscow or Beijing also split. All over the world, the left split. That happened in Pakistan too. NAP, which was the umbrella party of the left, including nationalists, split into NAP Wali and NAP Bhashani. So in West Pakistan, particularly in Balochistan and NWFP at the time, NAP was the major party, and they had an alliance with the JUI, Maulana Fazlur Rahman's father, Mufti Mahmud, who was an old Deobandi nationalist mullah. Do you know who the Deobandis are? Yeah. Deoband, great center of the whole Wahhabi sects growth in the subcontinent, so on and so forth. When partition took place, they had a Jamiyat-e-Ulama-e-Hind that remained in India. But the part that came to Pakistan, then they changed to Jamiyat-e-Ulama-e-Islam. And actually one faction also went and formed the Jamiyat-e-Ulama-e-Pakistan. That's another story. Anyway, so this NAP-JUI combine or alliance now comes into the political picture, taking advantage of this historic turn because of the nature of the agitation, its length, its widespread nature, and so on, and thereby the consent of the establishment perforce to allowing democratic elections and undoing one unit parity and so on and so forth, and accepting one man, one vote, taking advantage of the historic moment, decided to participate in the elections. Unlike Bhashani, as I said. Bhashani, for his strange pro-Beijing reasons, decided not to. And the consequences were nothing short of historic. So the results of the 1970 election come in. And Awami League sweeps East Pakistan, all but 2 seats. So they have a majority, simple majority. So by all reckoning, logic, principle, Sheikh Mujib should now be given the government and he should be the Prime Minister of Pakistan. He'd fought the election on a 6-point program. the famous 6 points of Sheikh Mujib, which in some senses addressed what were the historical grievances of East Pakistan, particularly the exploitation of its exports and the foreign exchange earned thereby to industrialize West Pakistan. So they wanted the retention of foreign exchange earned abroad through exports by the province itself. So Sheikh Mujib's 6 points was seen by some people as an attempt to change the federal structure of Pakistan into a confederal one.
What does that mean?
Confederal is a structure whereby the provinces have actually more power than the center, whereas a federal one, so a confederal structure implies that the constituent units of the state surrender some powers to the center, whereas a federal structure implies that the center surrenders some of its powers to the provinces or the constituent units. It's the origin of where the powers come from and who surrenders how much, what, to whom. That's the difference. Bhutto, whose People's Party had won in West Pakistan and in 2 provinces of Punjab and Sindh, after the 70 elections, there is a hiatus. The military regime is now discussing with Sheikh Mujib on one side and Bhutto on the other side whether to accept Sheikh Mujib's demand, naturally, that I won the election, give me power, or hedge that transfer of power by some means in order to allay the apprehensions of the establishment and parties like Mr. Bhutto's about what Sheikh Mujib's 6 points in practice would bring about. You see the traditional mindset. Don't forget, Bhutto Sahib was part of the Ayub government. He rose to become its foreign minister. The fact that he then was kicked out and formed his own party, the People's Party, in opposition, which eventually became the major force, in the 68-69 movement, and that arguably is what laid the foundations for its victory in the 70 elections. Nevertheless, in terms of mindset, background, history came from a strong center ambience. So very apprehensive about weakening that. These negotiations, unfortunately, were not getting anywhere. In September, I think, 1970, major floods hit East Pakistan. And the response of the government to, rescue, relief, etc., was, to put it politely, less than adequate. Fueling further the resentment in East Pakistan about its treatment and its people's treatment. So you can see how the climate is deepening the gulf, feeding the old resentments with new ones, adding to the old resentments new ones, and so the divide is getting deeper and wider. By March 1971, all this process is still going on. Negotiations. Sort of stop-start negotiations. Now the agitation is, the alienation and anger and agitation in East Pakistan is rising. The cry is heard, we won the elections, give us power. And the regime is not transferring power. So, on March 26th, I think, if I'm not mistaken, Sheikh Mujib announces a rally in the major ground in Dhaka called Paltan Maidan. Huge rally. The expectation of most pro-establishment writers, journalists, commentators is he is going to announce independence. Although I don't think Mujib had any such idea. And subsequent events bear me out. But, such is the nature of paranoia, that you ascribe to the opponent something that perhaps is not within his ken, and then act accordingly. So the military preempted what they thought was coming, i.e. a declaration of independence, but it didn't. And nevertheless decided enough is enough. The Bengalis, the natives, are once more restive, they need to be put down. They launched a military genocide. There's no other word for it. First action was to kill the intelligentsia in Dhaka. And then anybody in his aunt who came in the way after that. Naturally, this genocidal crackdown, and of course Mujib and all were arrested, many people fled. And where would they flee? To India. Presenting India on a silver platter with the opportunity of a lifetime. Pakistan is so discredited because of this military crackdown, so isolated in the world. Gaali pad rahi thi Pakistan. Nobody had anything but abuse for Pakistan. We had lost by this action the sympathy and the perception of the world even before we lost the battle. So Pakistan's actions in East Pakistan, the military's actions in East Pakistan, isolated Pakistan internationally. It gave Indira Gandhi the chance of a lifetime. She made a few moves, very clever ones. One, she signed a treaty of friendship with the Soviet Union, I think August 71, which arguably laid the foundations for her plans to invade East Pakistan. And the justification given by India was that, they were inundated with refugees from East Pakistan, which was true. Something like, I believe, 10 million people were refugees in India from East Pakistan. And the garrison, our garrison in East Pakistan, was cut off logistically because they had blockaded the sea route, they had blocked the air route. To resupply logistics was a major problem. Isolated politically, internationally, garrison isolated in East Pakistan, a disaster in the making, which followed on December 16th, 1971. Okay? So the end result of all this, briefly, is the 70 elections mandate was not respected. They went back on it because it didn't suit them. Yaya's calculations were, it will be a fractured mandate and I'll play games with it. It turned out to be the exact opposite. Sweeps by two major parties in the two wings and minor parties in two provinces. And so, his room for maneuver shrank. And in true military despot style, he decided on a military solution. And we all know what happened, okay? Now, as I said, the Baloch had accepted a ceasefire in 1969. Their representative party in alliance with JUI had gone into the 1970 elections and won these two provinces. Now, when the crisis hit, Yaya's regime crumbled at the hands of another group of generals. Okay? They removed them. And having removed them, they then invited Bhutto Sahab, who was at that time touring. He was in the UN arguing Pakistan's case in the Security Council, which didn't get very far because he walked out in anger, and invited him back to take over. So Bhutto Sahab was installed by this new military junta as the first and hopefully the last civilian chief martial law administrator. In that role, he had a few things on his plate, urgent. First and foremost, he needed to negotiate with India a disengagement of forces on the Western Front, uh, adjustments to the territory that had changed hands to restore the status quo ante on the ground, and negotiate the release of approximately 90,000 prisoners of war, military and civilian. To that end, he needed the backing of the polity in Pakistan so as to be able to present to Indira Gandhi a united front, strengthened hand. So he negotiated with NAP and JUI and conceded not only their provincial governments that they should form them, but even conceded their governors, who traditionally are the appointees and representatives of the president. And when this agreement was reached in negotiations, then the April 1972 interim constitution was promulgated, and under it Bhutto Sahab, from first civilian chief martial law administrator, was installed as the president. So having consolidated his home ground backyard, he then went to Simla for a summit with Indira Gandhi, where they negotiated. And he did manage to get the prisoners of war back and the adjustments on the Western Front on the ground, and conceded in turn to Indira Gandhi from a weak hand that Kashmir would now no longer be taken up on international forums but discussed bilaterally, which is what India holds us to this day. Not that we don't raise it in international forums, but every time we do, India objects on the basis of the Simla Accord. Now, in Balochistan, the NAP leader, Sardar Ataullah Mengal, one of the four major leaders of Balochistan, three major leaders and one other leader of Balochistan, Nawab Khairbakhsh Mari, president of NAP Balochistan, Sardar Ataullah Mengal, Ghaus Bakhsh Bazenjo, and Gul Khan Nasir, the poet. These are major figures. So Sardar Ataullah becomes the chief minister of Balochistan under the interim April 72 constitution. His government lasts for about 10 months. And it's a very turbulent 10 months. Because what seems to transpire is that Mr. Bhutto has played a hand in order to have a strengthened negotiating position in Simla. But now that he's achieved what he set out to do in Simla, he turns on or reverses his attitude, particularly to the Balochistan government. Trouble is brewed. The first police strike in Pakistan's history takes place in Balochistan. They strike against the elected chief minister. And there is room to believe that it was not as innocent as it seems, i.e. it was instigated. And then certain tribal chieftains who are aligned with Islamabad mount a mini rebellion in parts of Balochistan. And the police refuse to move against them. And so the chief minister, wisely or not, in hindsight can be argued, organizes a tribal lashkar to go and combat them. All these are considered grounds, according to Mr. Bhutto, for the dismissal of that government on February 15th, 1973. As a backdrop, the same Nawab Akbar Bugti, whom we shall come to later, who was killed in 2006, angry and alienated from NAP because they had rejected his request to be made governor of Balochistan, goes and conspires with Bhutto, fills his ears with alarmist stories about a guerrilla army being raised in Balochistan and Balochistan breaking away. And then there is this strange episode of an arms shipment being discovered from the Iraqi embassy, which it is claimed is intended for the Baloch guerrilla army. And it becomes an international diplomatic incident. So all these things are put together as a case And then on February 15th, Mr. Bhutto dismisses Sardar Ataulah's ministry. The inevitable rebellion occurs. And largely it is the same pattern of tribal resistance, but there is one element in it which is different, and that is a modern guerrilla group with which I have some history. Okay, that struggle breaks out soon after the February 15th dismissal, and that guerrilla resistance continues until Bhutto is overthrown in 1977. Now, some markers along the way. The spontaneous tribal resistance begins soon after the dismissal. My group that is working in the Murray area is not willing to fight at that point. We feel we are not ready. Our time frame was much longer, and we were still in the very preliminary stages of preparing an insurgency. So we thought a premature struggle would go against us. So we were reluctant. 2 months went by. And then we ran up against the danger of the broader nationalist front breaking up because of our reluctance. Others were resenting, knowing the Murray's capability, which they had proved in the 62-69 struggle, being the main force. Lot of resentment. And therefore, to prevent the breakup of the broader nationalist front, in May 73, we too joined the struggle. Now, the way the trajectory of the struggle went from there is of some importance. There were in all about 12 groups in different areas of Balochistan involved in the armed struggle, different tribal groups, including ours. Of those 12, 11 either collapsed over time or were eliminated, and those who survived left for Afghanistan to seek refuge. Inside Murray area, we were one of 8 groups. And when one of those groups was defeated in a very major battle, they made the mistake of a positional battle in Chamaling, which is a grazing ground, and were defeated. And so a great outflux of refugees, families, women, children, with some accompanying males, fled to Afghanistan for safety. The result of that debacle was that all 8 of these groups eventually came under our command. Not only that, because, as I said, the other 11 groups over time were whittled away, we became essentially the only group fighting by the end. That, as I said, redoubled what were our initial apprehensions about a premature struggle, brought great pressure on us, and of course, the twists and turns of a struggle eventually caught up with us too, and we were faced with great difficulties. But I think to our credit, we held out. We were not annihilated. We were not demolished. We didn't fritter away. We didn't disappear. We continued the resistance right to the end. Now, in July 77, when General Ziaul Haq overthrew Bhutto, which was the culmination of an agitation that broke out after the 1977 elections, because the opposition said they were rigged. So on the basis of that charge, a widespread agitation broke out against the Bhutto government, and a conglomeration of opposition parties called the Pakistan National Alliance, PNA. And eventually, Mr. Bhutto negotiated with the PNA, and one of the demands of the PNA, it may be of interest to you to know, was halting the military operation in Balochistan, withdrawal of the army, release of prisoners, compensation to those affected by the military operations. These were our demands, but taken up by the PNA and put on the table in the negotiations with Mr. Bhutto. First, he was reluctant. He even called in General Ziaul-Haq, his Chief of Army Staff, to brief the opposition parties on the situation on the ground with the guerrillas in Balochistan and their alleged links with Afghanistan and so on and so forth, and said we can't. On the day of July 4th, in the last session with the PNA, Bhutto finally conceded these demands. And on that night, July 4th, 5th, General Ziaul-Haq moved and toppled Mr. Bhutto. So you can see that Mr. Bhutto reluctantly, willy-nilly agreed, conceded these demands because he saw no other way to get this, diffuse this agitation and allow a fresh election to be held, which was the demand of the PNA. But the military under General Ziaul-Haq was not willing to concede this demand and moved. So the X factor in the July 5th, 1977 coup is Balochistan. And I think if you read the accounts of those negotiations between the PNA and Mr. Bhutto, that will come out somewhere or the other. For the simple reason that whereas after a series of protracted negotiations, Bhutto was at first unwilling to concede the main demand of the opposition alliance, the Pakistan National Alliance, PNA, for a fresh election based on the charges of rigging in the 77 elections, which the second half of which the opposition had boycotted. Once the National Assembly elections took place, the provincial were due within days, but they boycotted them because they said these are, rigged elections. By the time they were converging, the two sides, on agreeing to fresh elections, the other issue that came up in the negotiations was the military campaign that Bhutto had launched in Balochistan. After he dismissed Ataullah Mengel's ministry in 1973 and had launched a military offensive, that war was still on. And so the PNA, amongst whom there were parties or leaders sympathetic to what was happening to the Baloch, they raised the demands that the Baloch resistance had been raising for many years, which essentially boiled down to a ceasefire, withdrawal of the army to barracks, release of prisoners, and compensation to those who had suffered life or material losses during the war. Bhutto was reluctant to concede this, and he called in his Chief of Army Staff, General Ziaul-Haq, to explain to the opposition why it was not possible, which he did. But in the end, the pressure told on Bhutto, and he realized that if he didn't make these concessions that the PNA was asking for, there would be no agreement, the crisis would continue, the agitation against his government would continue, and it might fall anyway. So to stave off that outcome, he did make this concession literally at the 11th hour on July the 4th, 1977. And that night, the night of the 4th and 5th, General Ziaul-Haq toppled his government through a military coup. So I think one can argue, without fear of too much contradiction, that Balochistan certainly played a role and may even have played a central role in the events of July 5th. Now, it's interesting to see what transpires subsequently. General Ziaul-Haq, who'd overthrown Bhutto's government and put him under house arrest in Murree, went to see Bhutto. And the photographs and film of that meeting and the transcript of that meeting is very interesting, because Ziaul-Haq, who had been actually plucked from a relatively junior position as a general and elevated to the Chief of Army Staff, I think Bhutto thought that he was a very subservient and loyal choice. Of course, time proved otherwise. but that has more to do with the institutional interests of the army rather than the person. Now, Ziaul Haq at first was very deferential to Bhutto, almost apologetic for what he said he had been forced to do, because, the demands that Bhutto had conceded were beyond acceptability for the military. I'm paraphrasing. And the meeting didn't go badly. There wasn't the level of animosity that you might have expected. And so Ziaul Haq felt confident enough within weeks to release Bhutto from house arrest. Bhutto then embarked on a train tour to mobilize his support. And the reception he got was so huge because, in our political culture, we tend to be with the underdog. And so whatever complaints people had about Bhutto or about his government, suddenly once he had been overthrown and was out of power, there was a surge of sympathy for him. Now that alarmed Ziaul Haq because I think he was very familiar with Bhutto's character and temperament. Bhutto has been called a vengeful person. And I think Ziaul Haq really was apprehensive that if on the run of support a fresh election was held, which by the way Ziaul Haq promised in 90 days after the coup, immediately in his speech he promised fresh elections in 90 days, i.e. a return to civilian rule. Of course, it was a long time coming, as we know. But I think he grew apprehensive that if Bhutto came back to power through a fresh election, Ziaul Haq's neck would be on the chopping block, literally. So I think it became a perception of my neck or yours. And that is probably the reason why a murder case that had been lodged against Bhutto while he was in power by Mr. Ahmed Raza Kasuri, who was a dissident PPP MNA. And it was alleged in the case that an attempt to assassinate Ahmed Raza Kasuri ended up in him escaping by the skin of his teeth, but his father, who was in the vehicle with him, being killed. Ahmed Raza Kasuri's father. That case had been lying with the courts, but dormant. I don't think the judiciary had the courage of its convictions to proceed with that case. And these things can happen in the judicial system, which in any case is not known for quick justice or efficient justice. Now suddenly Ziaul Haq latched onto this case and Bhutto was arrested on a murder charge. The murder trial was a travesty. It was conducted in the Lahore High Court by a bench headed by the Chief Justice at that time, Maulvi Mushtaq, who had a lot of resentment and anger against Bhutto because apparently he'd been bypassed by Bhutto in terms of elevation, etc. And his conduct in court was simply appalling for a Chief Justice of a High Court. The bias was floating on the surface, the hostility to Bhutto was floating on the surface and visible in the courtroom. So I think when he was sentenced to death, any reasonable, sane mind, objective mind, would have said that this didn't meet the demands of justice, that trial. Nevertheless, an appeal was lodged in the Supreme Court, and then strange thing happened there, because two of the judges on that bench, it was a full bench hearing the appeal, two of them, one retired, and the other one mysteriously came under some kind of pressure and disappeared from the country. He left the country surreptitiously. These were very strange happenings. And so you could say that Supreme Court Chief Justice Anwarul Haq's bench then delivered, despite this, a split decision. It was not unanimous, upholding the death sentence. And jurists have said to me that the principles of jurisprudence would have seemed to suggest, A, because it was a split decision, There were dissenting notes to the judgment, which Anwar wrote. And because you were dealing with a former Prime Minister of the country, it would have been more appropriate. And in any case, he was not accused of actually pulling the trigger. He was accused of having initiated the attack on Ahmed Raza Kasuri. And so jurisprudence seemed to suggest, for all these reasons, that it would have been more appropriate to change the death sentence to life imprisonment. But the court, in its wisdom, saw otherwise. And Justice Naseem Hassan Shah, who's just recently died and later became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, has written a book in which, many years later of course, in which he confessed to the pressures that the court came under to deliver the verdict that Zia ul Haq wanted. So I think in the annals of jurisprudence, this is a case that goes down as not meeting the demands of due process, fair play and justice, and has been so seen not only in Pakistan by large sections of people but internationally. That's why the PPP is inclined to call it a judicial murder. Now that may be strong words, but nevertheless the fact is that the man lost his life in circumstances that are certainly questionable, despite his guilt that may have been proved during the case, that he did order the killing, despite that. Okay. Now, interestingly, while Zia ul Haq is wrestling with Mr. Bhutto now, having initially been very deferential and then having released him and realized that, his neck may be on the chopping block if Bhutto comes back to power, and then this whole process of trying him and eventually executing him on April the 4th, 1979. When he came into confrontation with Bhutto and the PPP, Zia ul Haq decided that he couldn't fight on two fronts. And the bigger front, or the more dangerous front, was the People's Party, because it was countrywide, and so therefore try to diffuse the Baloch situation. So the irony is that the man who opposed these demands of the Baloch resistance movement as voiced through the PNA then conceded them. These are the ironies and twists and turns of history, you see. So Zia ul Haq, the objector to any concessions to the Baloch resistance, is the man in power who actually then finally concedes these. And as part of those concessions, yes, there was one more demand which I forgot to mention, and that was that the entire leadership of NAP, both the Baloch leadership as well as the NWFP leadership, Wali Khan, etc., had all been gathered together and charged with waging war on the state in the Hyderabad conspiracy case. And they were all incarcerated in Hyderabad prison, and the case was being heard in the prison, for security reasons. And he then withdrew that case, Zia ul Haq, and freed them on January the 1st, 1978, a mere 6 months after the coup. So Zia ul Haq was trying to defuse the situation of the insurgency in Balochistan, and there was resistance in NWFP also, and so he was trying to settle that front and deal with Bhutto and the People's Party. Now, the situation in Balochistan, even before Zia ul Haq made these concessions, was a military stalemate. Despite what I told you of the collapse of many fronts and many groups in the Baloch resistance over the years, the military had virtually been fought to a standstill. They were unable to prevail despite superior weaponry, resources, logistics, all the rest of it. And so they had become relatively passive. They'd stopped patrolling, they were sitting in their camps, secure, fully protected, and didn't seem very interested in going after the guerrillas. So in a sense they had conceded space to the guerrilla movement, which was intact to the extent that I told you.